Many of you will know Ratnaghosha from his previous visits, but also we have grown as a Sangha a lot in the last couple of years since Ratnaghosha was last able to visit. So some of you won't have had the pleasure of meeting Ratnaghosha. So Ratnaghosha has been involved in the Triratna movement for many, many years. So he was the manager of Friends Foods in London, which was a team-based right livelihood. That was in the 80s, is that right? Yes. Yeah. And then he became the chair at the LBC, the London Buddhist Centre, which many of you will know is sort of quite a flagship leading Buddhist centre now. So Ratnaghosha was involved then in the earlier days. And then he moved to Cambridge to become the chair of the Cambridge Buddhist Centre. And more recently, Ratnaghosha has retired and moved to Adhisthana. So he's now living at Adhisthana and he's on the Dharma team at Adhisthana. So yeah, it's really lovely actually meeting Ratnaghosha this afternoon and hearing him talk about that life and how, he's able to serve and give, but also there's sort of that a bit of spaciousness in his life and really sort of enjoying the environment and the sort of surroundings at Adhisthana. But yeah, just a bit more personally, I just wanted to rejoice really in Ratnaghosha's kindness. He's very kind. Ratnaghosha, when I meet him, he totally sort of fully takes me in, and I'm sure you'll have all had this experience if you've met him. He's very sort of present and he's really, he really sort of takes you in. But also I really love Ratnaghosha's Dharma teaching. It's very simple, but also very creative just creative at the same time. Like you often say things that I think, I've just not quite heard it in that way, or not quite thought of it in that way. So yeah, I'm just really looking forward to hearing what Ratnaghosha is going to share with us this evening. And it's just such a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you, Kusla Devi. Yes, so I'm going to talk about I think I was asked to talk about something like the international nature of Triratna. But I want to start with the universal nature of Buddhism. Buddhism is a universal religion. So that means it's not addressed to any particular ethnic group or tribal group, or it's addressed to the individual human being. That's what it means to be a universal religion. It's addressed to the individual human being, regardless of nationality, race, sex, age, political views, regardless of any other kind of categories. And Buddhism shares that with, Christianity is also a universal religion. Islam is a universal religion. Actually, originally Islam was ethnic because the Arab tribes wanted a prophet. They felt the need for a prophet to establish themselves as equals to the Jewish tribes who had prophets. But of course, as it expanded, it was addressed to all the peoples that it encountered. So a universal religion is one that it can be practiced regardless of all these other divisions: nationality, tribal allegiance, or race, or sex, or age, or whatever. It's just for the individual human being. But of course, as religions spread to different countries, they begin to take on the characteristics of the culture and so on. And over centuries, the different cultures develop ethnic or national forms, the different religions in the different cultures. They develop a kind of ethnic or national form. And then religion starts to become a form of identity for some particular group. And then it becomes a means of differentiating from others. Yeah. And that has happened with Buddhism as well. As Buddhism spread, it too began to take on the characteristics of the different cultures it encountered. And human beings being what they are, it also began to be identified with particular ethnic groups and so on. So over the centuries, different forms of what we call ethnic Buddhism emerged. So that's Buddhism as a group identity rather than as a personal practice. So that has emerged. And this sometimes even became quite political and nationalistic. For instance, in Japan, in China, in Thailand, in Burma, in Sri Lanka, religion was and still is, in some cases, used to create and maintain divisions, yeah, in society. It happens in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma. There are some people who use Buddhism as a way of attacking Muslims, for instance, and similarly in Sri Lanka. In Japan, there have been times when Buddhism, in a way, has had no choice but to be an imperial religion. Yeah, and at times in Japanese history, Buddhism has even been used to justify violence. So that in a way, it shows how far things can degenerate. Yeah, that's also happened in China. So that's the kind of deterioration that can happen. Can come about when the basic doctrines of Buddhism get lost in this kind of cultural and political mishmash. Yeah. So about 150 years ago, due to trade and due to the empires, Buddhism began to be known in the West. There were Westerners who became Buddhist monks towards, well, in Burma and Sri Lanka in particular, at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And sometimes those people who became Buddhist monks, some of them were quite dubious characters, in fact. They were what was known as beachcombers, yeah, some of them. They were known as beachcombers in the East. And they were what would have been called hobos in America, or probably vagrants in Britain, yeah. So some of them simply became Buddhist monks for a free meal and so on. But some were definitely keen on Buddhism. So there were some of those early Westerners who were keen on Buddhism. One was an Irish monk called Dhammaloka. He was very active in Burma at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century. A very interesting character he was, yeah. But what he was very occupied with, he was a Buddhist monk, he was very occupied trying to undermine the efforts of Christian missionaries, yeah, and encouraging Burmese nationalism, yeah, in opposition to the British Empire. And he was quite successful at that. Like thousands of people used to attend his talks in Burma, thousands. And he was doing something that the Burmese monks couldn't do by directly countering the authorities as well. He did some very good work actually developing schools for the children of the poor. He developed schools for teaching English because of course, English was the language you needed to get on in the empire. Yeah. There was another monk called Ananda Matteya, he was more involved in trying to convert Westerners and particularly intellectuals to Buddhism. And those early Western Buddhist monks, they didn't make that much distinction between Buddhism and other kind of ideologies, such as what was called free thinking at the time, or maybe socialism, things like that. For instance, they used to publish tracts, and some of the tracts they published were people like Tom Paine, who was famous in terms of his involvement with the French Revolution, and also a lot of their tracts were simply anti-Christian tracts, yeah, against the missionaries. And those early Western Buddhist monks were also slightly being used by the Burmese Buddhist establishment, who saw them as a useful boost to their own position within the politics and the political and religious landscape and so on. Anagarika Dharmapala, whom some of you will have heard of, he was also part of that expansion of Buddhism beyond its national and ethnic boundaries. Yeah. Actually, he and that Irish monk Dhammaloka did a big tour of Sri Lanka at one time. The Theosophists like Colonel Olcott and Annie Besant, they were also played a part in this taking Buddhism out of Asia and towards the West. And then later, of course, in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a whole wave of Western interest in Buddhism. And eventually with the Beats and the hippies and other travelers to the East, people starting to take up a serious personal practice of Buddhism, there was a gradual importation of Buddhism to the West, yeah? And also, of course, there was a flow of Eastern Buddhists from Vietnam, from Sri Lanka, from Japan, and then from Tibet. And that grew into quite a large presence in the United States and in European countries by the 1970s and the 1980s. And Bhante Sangharakshita was part of this kind of large importation of Buddhist practices into the West. Most of the Buddhism that came from the East retained its national and cultural characteristics. So there seemed to be many Buddhisms, yeah? It would have been difficult for anyone who was unfamiliar with those cultures and the history and so on, history and growth of Buddhism, to see how they all belonged to the same faith or the same path. And it was also difficult for Asian Buddhists because they came to the West and were encountering other forms of Buddhism, in many cases for the first time. It hadn't happened before. Sri Lankan Buddhists would not have encountered Tibetan Buddhists, but then they all came west and started to become more aware of each other. Anyway, this is where Triratna and Bhante come into the picture of Buddhism coming from the east to the west. In 1956, Bhante's book, The Survey of Buddhism, was published. And that in that book, he tried to make it really clear what all the different forms of Buddhism had in common. Yeah? And he tried to point out where the differences were cultural or national or historical, rather than some fault of the original teachings of the Buddha. Yeah. So that was it's probably hard for us to realize what a big event the publication of that book was. There weren't many books on Buddhism in the 1950s, nothing like what we experience now, when there are thousands and thousands of books on Buddhism. There weren't many. And here was this book, A Survey of Buddhism. Any books that would have been there would have been quite partial, as it were. So that was a major kind of contribution to Buddhism, that book, A Survey of Buddhism, and it still is in a way. Anyway, so Buddhism, although it is a universal religion, yeah, it can become something less. It can become something less. Just as Christianity or Islam can be used for political purposes, so can Buddhism. And just as you know, other religions have taken on different cultural forms and so on in different cultures, then Buddhism has done the same. And just as other religions have become sectarian, Buddhism has become sectarian. I'm not making a very good case for Buddhism here, am I? So universal religions are addressed to the individual human being. But human beings are often not individuals. They're often group members, yeah? And therefore they turn the religion into a group phenomenon, yeah? Or into a tribal phenomenon or a national phenomenon. In a way, the phrase a Buddhist country, or even a Christian country or an Islamic country, it should be a contradiction in terms. It shouldn't be possible to have a Buddhist country. You have Buddhists, but not a whole country. So what Bhante has done is he's endeavored to make sure that Triratna teaches Buddhism that is addressed to the individual, addressed to the spiritual needs of the individual, and not to any division, as it were, of humanity, not to any national or racial or political or whatever division. So that's the task that he took up, to try and teach Buddhism in its essence, as it were, rather than any particular brand of Buddhism. And he's pursued that in his writings, in seminars, in talks, in the creation of Buddhist centers, in encouraging his disciples to disseminate the Dharma everywhere and to make it accessible to everybody. So it's a huge task, yeah? And in many ways, it's a task that we've only just begun. Yeah, it's not a task that we've by any means completed. We've only just begun. We've only just begun in the sense that we're a very small Buddhist movement. There are only 2,500 order members in the whole world. There are 7 billion people in the whole world. There are only 2,500 order members, yeah? So we've only just begun. And we've only just begun in the sense that we've only established ourselves in a few countries and a few cultures. And in some of those places, we only have a handful of order members, like in Venezuela or in Turkey, or even in places like New Zealand. Yeah, and we've only just begun also because we're still, as it were, fledgling Buddhists. Yeah, and we're still very much attached to our nation and our culture, our opinions, our politics, our group identities of one kind or another. Yeah, it takes quite a lot to rise above and transcend those kind of attachments. And because of all these attachments, and because we're so small, it's still easy for us to, as it were, fall over and not make the progress that we ought to make, given all the advantages that we have. So we have a lot of advantages. We have advantages such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Again, things that we may even take for granted, which are by no means common throughout the world. We have advantages such as relative freedom from worry about life's basic necessities, such as food and shelter and clothing. And of course, sometimes it's these very good conditions and advantages that cause us to be complacent, even careless, and risk our unity and risk our harmony. Yeah. The greatest threat, really, the greatest threat to the spiritual community, to the Sangha, is the threat of division. It's the threat of division. That's what's happened in the history of religions. It's what's happened in the history of Buddhism, and we're very small, but that threat is still there. The threat of division. Yeah. And we live in a world where there are so many divisions, so many people also who delight in creating and stoking the fires of division. Yeah, this is kind of played out on our screens, as it were, and in our streets. There have always been divisions. There have always been divisions between people, and that's how wars and so on have resulted from that. So there have always been divisions, but nowadays these divisions are amplified. They're amplified 1,000-fold, you could say, by all the very clever communications technology that we have at our fingertips. Yeah. So this communications technology is designed, as it were, to turn us all into device addicts. Yeah. We're device addicts and news junkies, as it were. And the communication technology is devised to grab and keep our attention. I think this is kind of incidental to what I'm talking about, but I think technology addiction, as it were, is a serious kind of issue that we probably all need to address in our own lives. I think it's something that has, in a way, kind of crept up on us, you know, just in a very recent times. And it's something that we all need to kind of take a look at, I think, because of this kind of serious problem of the amplification of divisions. Yeah, so if you think about what news is always something that's exceptional, isn't it? News is not normal life, it's something exceptional. And news, what do you call them? The institutions who put out the news, they're trying to grab your attention. So the more spectacular or intense it is, the more likely it is to be pushed in your direction. And when there's tension, when there's division, when there's dispute or anything like that, that's what creates interest. So that's what you're going to be getting. You know, you're going to be getting things that highlight division, highlight tension. And of course, we're not immune. We're not immune to being influenced. Yeah, the fact that we're meditating and trying to be aware and so on doesn't make us completely immune to being influenced to take up partisan positions and so on. And we have to be very careful. We kind of bring real awareness to what we're taking in, so that we don't actually get so influenced that we start to consider other people enemies and so on. Yeah. Because when we start to see others as enemies or as opposed to us, then we're in a way, we're on a road to undermining what we're trying to do with our lives, but also undermining perhaps Sangha, the creation of Sangha. And the creation of Sangha is really essential to effective practice of the Dharma. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was saying that they've been away from the Sangha for some time, and they realized just how impossible almost it is to practice without a community. It's very, very difficult. So we need to beware, as it were, of introducing partisan arguments and so on into the Sangha. And we need to beware of what am I trying to say? We need to be aware of the values that we're taking our stand on, as it were. So there are some values which seem very close to Buddhist values. You know, so the basic Buddhist values, you could say, are something like metta, awareness, taking responsibility for your own mental states. Those are kind of very basic Buddhist values. But there are other values which may seem really close to them, but you have to really think about it. for instance, let's say the value of hope. Why is hope not a Buddhist value? Yeah, it's a quite. I mean, I can give you an answer to it, but I'm just throwing these things out for you to think about. Why is justice not a Buddhist value? Why is justice doesn't get mentioned in Buddhism? Why is fairness never mentioned in Buddhism? Yeah. So what I'm saying, I'm not saying these things are bad things or good things. I'm just saying it's important that we think about what our values are, where they come from, and the discourse that our values belong to, because some of those other things that may seem like they're close to Buddhist values, they often come from a very different discourse. Yeah, so it's important to kind of think about these things and try and understand more deeply what we really believe or what we really want to live out in our lives. Yeah. So the Dharma is open to everyone. The Dharma is addressed to every human being. So it's not just addressed to people who share our culture or our nationality or anything like that. It's not just addressed to people who share our views or our opinions. It's not just addressed to those who agree with our politics. It's addressed to everyone. Yeah, and so we need to welcome everyone to our Buddhist centers, for instance. We need to try and have a perspective that goes way beyond our own corner of the world and our own corner of Triratna. Yeah. And we need to welcome everyone because it's fundamental to Buddhism that everyone has the potential to grow and change. So anything that blocks or frustrates another person's potential for growth is really, in a way, it's a kind of act of violence against their spiritual being. Yeah. And as Dharma practitioners, we're really concerned primarily to develop wisdom and to act out of loving kindness, which is the expression of that wisdom. And that means, in some ways, it means something quite simple. It means being friendly. Yeah, it means being helpful. It means being encouraging. It means allowing people their freedom, even the freedom to make mistakes. Yeah, even the freedom to be stupid. Yeah, we have to allow people that freedom. It means, where possible, trying to allay the fears of people, to try and reduce their anxieties, not increase their anxieties. Yeah? It means creating the best conditions for people to grow and develop insofar as we can. Yeah? And it means responding to people positively, even if they don't like us. Yeah? Not rejecting people, not writing them off. That's a tall order. We have to really work on ourselves and train ourselves to get to be able to even approach that. It also means, of course, not allowing ourselves to be manipulated or bullied, yeah, which harks back to, not just our relationships with other people, but with things like communications technology and so on. Because sometimes, without even knowing it, we're being manipulated and we're being bullied. And we have to be aware of that and don't allow that to happen to ourselves. Yeah, we have to take responsibility for ourselves in that way. So, of course, one way, this is coming back to my topic, one way of working against any tendency to polarize or any tendency to parochialism or divisiveness is to be aware of the international nature of the Triratna community. Yeah. We can become aware of the international nature of this whole Buddhist movement by paying attention to what's happening in other countries, such as India, which you've been doing, Mexico, Australia, Russia, Germany, wherever, Sweden, and so on. I worked out that Triratna is in about 25 countries. Yeah, I was trying to make a list while you were on your tea break. There's the local countries, England, Scotland, Wales. Turkey, Venezuela, Brazil, Germany, Canada, US, Ireland, hello Morna, Holland, Belgium, Spain, Estonia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, New Zealand. There might be others I didn't think of during the tea break, but anyway, it's in those countries. In some places it's very tiny. In Turkey, there's just one order member. In other places, it's a bit bigger. So there are all these Triratna activities, as I say, in about 25 countries. There's also, of course, we can take an interest in those, but we can also broaden out from our own centre by going on retreat at some of the retreat centres where you can meet people from other UK centres initially, get a sense of the variety of people involved. You can also, of course, go on retreat to retreat centres outside the UK. There are retreat centres around Europe and so on. And we just need to work on broadening our own perspective. Sometimes we can get so caught up in the passion of particular issues and so on that we may forget that others may not share our passion. Yeah, and you know that means we can create a particular atmosphere that other people might feel difficult to come into. For instance, I know of a case where something like this happened during the Scottish referendum, where there was a lot of passion and people at, I won't say which Buddhist centre, people that you might guess, really talking a lot about that particular issue and so on, and most of them sharing the same view. And I know of one case at least where someone didn't share that view and felt kind of excluded, felt kind of like, I'm not sure if there's a place for me here. I also know of a case where someone was accused of not being a proper Buddhist because of their political views. You know, that wasn't to do with Scotland. It's just very easy for us to polarize along the same lines as the rest of the world, basically. And as I said, there's plenty of encouragement online and elsewhere for us to do just that. So that's all the more reason why we have to be careful not to confuse our own views about particular issues of the day with the awakened mind of the Buddha. Yeah. So until we've, as it were, attained to an advanced stage of the Buddha's path, we can kind of assume that we're likely to be deluded. Yeah. Or we're likely to have a limited perspective. And therefore, we need to be very provisional in our assertions of what's true and try to be looser with our attachments, yeah? So, and we just need to emphasize as much as possible what unites us as Buddhists and as Triratna Buddhists. We need to try and emphasize as much as possible what unites us. What unites us also with other Buddhists, and indeed what unites us with all human beings, all facing the same human existential predicament. So it's important that we really cherish and nourish our connections with each other by regarding each other with friendliness and gratitude even, yeah. As I said earlier, without a spiritual community of like-minded practitioners, it's really very difficult to follow a spiritual path, yeah. That's my own experience as well. I became a Buddhist before I got involved with Triratna, and I was really floundering, trying to find how to practice, just simply how to practice. I just didn't know how to practice. I kind of recognized the ideas and responded to them and so on, but I didn't know how to practice. I just needed a context. So by coming together and sharing our experience, coming together in harmony, coming together in friendliness as much as possible, sharing our experience of practicing ethics, sharing our experience of meditation, sharing our experience of going on retreat, so on. by doing that, we support each other. Yeah, by doing that, we create the conditions for the Dharma to become an effective influence in the world. And then if we deliberately then take an interest in those beyond our own center and beyond our own country and beyond our own culture, we'll be, as it were, multiplying the effective influence of the Dharma in the world. So mutual helpfulness is the kind of thread that creates the fabric of spiritual friendship and spiritual community. And in a way, you could say, spiritual friendship and spiritual communities of genuine spiritual practitioners, that's the ultimate answer to our problems and to the world's problems. Yeah. So we make a little start just by finding out about other Triratna groups and centers and perhaps visiting them, going on retreats, as I said, to other UK retreat centers, even going, when we're allowed, if we're allowed, to European retreat centers, Holland, Sweden, Finland, Spain, Germany. They've all got retreat centers. Even further afield, India, Mexico, US, New Zealand, Australia. So however we do it, it's really an excellent thing to make connections with the wider Triratna community beyond our center. I was thinking internationality is not really the right word to describe this need to transcend boundaries, because internationality is still based on the notion of separate nations, yeah? And that's, in a way, just an idea. And I was thinking global doesn't quite get it either, because global is a word that's become tainted by the attitudes of big corporations and so on. So what we want to do is to transcend the idea that there are any real boundaries or divisions between the people of this planet. Yeah, we want to reach for a perspective a bit like that of the astronauts who saw the Earth from space. Yeah, but we want it not just to be a visual or a sense-based perspective. We want to reach for a spiritual perspective that transcends all divisions and boundaries between us and sees with the eyes of compassion. And that is the perspective of a Buddha. That's a Buddhist perspective. And that's what we need to reach for in all our dealings with others. And that's truly reaching for the stars.
We need to name her.
We do. So we've got just over 15 minutes. Are you happy to take some questions if there are questions? I think that's probably the best way to use the time rather than breakout groups this time. Yeah. So yeah, if you've got any questions on Zoom, perhaps if Aryabhachan could keep an eye, if you sort of either raise your hand or wave somehow. And yeah, similarly in the room, if anyone's got any questions. Gareth, just to say, I'm going to repeat it afterwards. So yeah. So for those of you on Zoom, I'm going to repeat. Gareth's got a question.
So it was something like, how do we hold the need to produce? I don't know. I find it very inspiring that the way we work, like an expression of the Dharma, which kind of emerges naturally out of our culture, my culture. I'm not sure exactly what I mean by that, but it's sort of the Western Buddhism. And yet, at the same time, how do you hold that alongside? another sector.
Are you happy to repeat the question, or do you want me to do that?
Okay, so Garrett's question is, how do you hold the as it were, tension between wanting a Buddhism that arises out of or is, your own culture, or that's consistent with your own culture as well, but at the same time not becoming limited by that culture? Is that the question? Something like that, yeah. So it's an interesting question, because of course our culture is multifaceted, and you know, our culture covers everything from, you know, the Daily Star newspaper to Plato, yeah, and we can't kind of what we, in a way, what we really want to do is to find in our culture, in our higher culture as well, the values and so on that are what's the word, consonant with Buddhism, that are agree with Buddhist values, but we need to, as it were, reject aspects of our culture that don't agree with those values. And the other thing is there's culture. You know, we talk about our culture. You can talk about our culture as being maybe there's a British culture, for instance. Maybe there's even a Nottingham culture, you know, or there's a European culture, or sometimes people talk about a Western culture. So what is the culture, say, of Mexico? Is it a European culture? Is it is it something else? And Triratna is in these different places, even the United States of America. What is the culture of the United States? Is it a European culture? Is it something else? So whatever those cultures are, it's like what we have to do is bring an intelligent kind of discernment to it. And we have to do that from a basis of being immersed in the Dharma. And that means being immersed in the practice and the kind of realizations that come from the practice. So being immersed in awareness, being immersed in metta, and so on. And from that, being able to discern aspects of the culture that are, support Dharmic values, and other aspects that don't support it. And I think that's what Bhante has been trying to do when he's talked about the arts and so on, for instance. He's been trying to discern, this poet, Shelley, or someone really has values that are very similar to Buddhism, or this artist, or whatever. And then somebody else maybe no. Yeah. So it's not a simple matter, basically, even though I made it sound simple. Connor.
Yes, it really resonates with the point you made earlier about not getting too bound up in partisan politics and separating oneself out from political views. If I'm honest, as a view of social really need to be evaluated on activism. But at the same time, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say it's not really possible in today's society to be apolitical. Even not taking a view in politics is taking a view in politics, if you see what I mean. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and how to kind of hold both of those at the same time.
Okay, it's another question about tensions between one thing and another. Connor is asking the question about politics and partisan views in politics, and Connor's saying it's not possible to be apolitical, to have no political view. You have to have some view. And how do you square that with the tension of not becoming so partisan? Again, I will come back to the same point that actually it's not so much a question of the politics. It's more a question of the Buddhist values that you're bringing to it. Yeah, it's not so much a question of the issue, but how you are. What are you bringing to the issue, as it were? Whether the issue is Scottish independence or what are the other issues that we Brexit or whatever? Yeah, Brexit. Yeah, Brexit. Almost forgot about Brexit. Yeah. So, but like both of those maybe are examples of where you could have a very strong passion, such that you start to see the other people as being kind of evil almost or whatever. Yeah. So that's where it's not so much what we think is right or wrong. Most of the time, we actually probably haven't got enough information to be able to make a sensible decision anyway, even if we do want to be involved. But being able to do it on the basis of positive emotion, and awareness of other people. So it's a tall order. It's very, very difficult, I think. But the main point I'm making is that we don't want to add to divisiveness in the world. We don't want to add to that which in the end results in people killing each other. Yeah, that's the main point I'm making.
From Ireland, good morning. Up until a few years ago, when the Sri Lanka was Western Buddhist, could you explain the thinking behind changing the name? You see what you were saying, why it was necessary to change that to make it more global, if you like, more international. But maybe people who are not there and there yet WBO, and how that came about.
Okay, so Keith's question is, some years back, Triratna was called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and why did it change to Triratna? Actually, it was the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. It was also Trilokya Bauddha Mahasangha, which was the name of it in India. Yeah, and the basic reason for changing it to the Triratna Buddhist Order was so that it didn't have two names. But that was one reason. The other reason was because it was starting to spread to other cultures, and people like, for instance, in Mexico, they weren't really that comfortable with being referred to as Western Buddhists. Yeah? So, or other places like, for instance, there was a case in, I think it was Singapore, where people wanted to be involved and thought, Western Buddhist, can we be involved with the Western Buddhist order? So, and Malaysia and so on. So we had interest from people in those places. So it is, as you say, it's because Triratna was spreading to other countries that it needed a name that kind of allowed it to spread. But also interestingly, when Bhante first started the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order in Monmouth Street in London, when they dedicated the basement that they started in, they called it the Triratna Meditation Hall. Yeah, so that he had that name right there at the beginning. You know, the three jewels being really central. Yeah. Good, I haven't put you off then. That's good.
To mention something which was really lovely actually, which is Zach actually might be just so people on Zoom can hear. So Zach had a Kalyana Mitra ceremony this morning. So he's got a little mini shrine on our shrine at the moment. But the book that's there is actually the Survey of Buddhism. Yeah, which Ratnaghosha mentioned earlier. So I just thought that was a really lovely little connection when you mentioned that. Yeah.
I think I'll end off by talking about a particular part of Triratna. I mean, I know you've heard about India recently, and I know you've heard in the past about Venezuela from Arivachan. I want to mention Istanbul, because the order member in Istanbul is called Vajrachakshu, and I met him when he was a newcomer, came to the Buddhist Center in London. His parents were Turkish Cypriot refugees in Britain. He was born in London. He didn't speak Turkish at all. Quite an eccentric man, a lot of energy. I met him when he was quite young. And sometime after he was ordained, he had a dream. And in the dream, he was being asked to go to Istanbul to spread the Dharma. And he took it seriously. And he went to Istanbul. He didn't speak Turkish, as I said. He went there and he stayed there and he learned Turkish and he persisted. And it wasn't easy. I mean, it's a Muslim country. And, you know, he didn't know anybody. He didn't know the language. He persisted. And there is now a Sangha in Istanbul. And there are mitras there. And mitras of subordination, and it just there's an order member from Istanbul as well who lives in Cambridge, who's ordained by me. So I feel a connection with Istanbul because Vajrachakshu is a friend of mine, and I've been a mentor to him. He uses my talks for teaching material in Istanbul. So people in Istanbul know me, and I've done Zoom question and answer sessions with them and things like that. So yes, I just wanted to mention that as just to introduce you to another little section of Sri Ratna. You're going to leave it there?
Great. So yeah, just a final thank you to Ratnaghosha. I think let's give him another round of applause. So thanks. Yeah, it's just such a pleasure to listen to you, but also have you bringing in that much wider sort of movement that we're part of. Yeah, just very evocatively sort of bringing that to mind. So thank you. Yeah. Good. So do come along next week to connect again with India. So we'll be hearing from Kshantika, Kamasiri and Vanessa next week about their connections with India. So yeah, do come along for that. Sangha Night.